we'll be looking at how to put dialogue at the heart of internal communication. We're delighted to be joined by our speaker today, Dr. David Cowan, who will be talking to us about the core ideas of why dialogue between leaders and employees matters. David will also be sharing with us details of his effective communication tool, the Dialog Box, and how it can help companies explore more thoroughly the kinds of conversations they need to have with employees. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do post them, and we will hopefully have some time at the end for David to answer those. And also, just to let you know, the webinar will be recorded and available afterwards, so don't worry too much about taking notes from the slides. So now I just want to welcome David, and thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you virtually. I'm going to introduce myself and then some themes to talk about in terms of internal communications, and then focus on the dialog box and give you an idea of how it works. It's quite an easy tool in some respects, but it's also slightly counterintuitive perhaps, and it's also takes practice. I spend a couple of days teaching people this on a regular basis, and I'll refer to that as we go along. So to introduce myself, I'm not going to read everything that's there. Suffice to say that I've looked at communications from just about every angle in the business to business space. I've not been in consumer communications, never tried to sell hair shampoo or cars, but I have worked on the agency side, the client side, a public civil service like the World Bank, private companies, large agencies, small agencies, as a journalist. So I've really looked at this all the way around, also as an academic at Boston College in the US. And my book, The Strategic Internal Communication, really is based on that experience. And the Dialog Box came out of more years than I'd like to mention. You could probably notice a grey hair or two there. At the moment, I'm in a program teaching what I'm going to talk about today to an organization called SABIC, which is the largest company in the Middle East, listed company, and it's based in Saudi Arabia. And I've been training over 800 so far of their leaders around the world in Singapore, China, South Korea, America, Europe, etc. And it's had a 96% approval rating. So this tool comes to you with a fair amount of testing. I've also used it with other companies, and I'm going to give you a case study of an organization where I have used this in a real setting. So that's me very briefly. Whenever I talk about communications, I kind of start with this point that all external communication is internal, and all internal communication is external. What we see or hear as employees from the outside world influences us, and it communicates something about us. If we are working for a company and something great is said about that company in the outside world, that's a great internal communication for us. Likewise, if we're unhappy in an organization, we talk to the outside world. As a journalist, the best way for me to find out what was happening in the company was to speak to their competitors, and they would soon moan if they had something to moan about. So employees become quite a source of external information as well. So the boundary is not clear, and yet we have this department called internal communication, which is really needs to be better integrated. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about the woes of internal communication. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. But internal communication needs to be given much more priority than it is today in organizations, and should be much closer to the CEO of the organization than it usually is. It should be much more powerful than it is, because we live in a communications age, and to me, it's faintly ridiculous the way in which companies are still have a 20th century attitude towards communication. So when I talk about the 20th century, I'm talking about a paradigm shift from then to what we have today. That is that the 20th century was very much a one-way form of communication. It was hierarchy, it was broadcast, it was process driven. You know, we would write a press release, we would have a press conference, we would tell the employees, they were usually the last to know. So it was a whole process. And information was on a need to know. I'll tell you what you need to know. And of course, information was also perceived to be power. Also, the way in which we often communicated was product based. So buy this coffee because it comes from Kenya. Buy this computer because it has this amount of memory and it goes this fast. In the 21st century, and we're not quite here yet, but this is what we're transitioning into, we are in a world of transparency. And I don't just mean in terms of WikiLeaks, but also in terms of the requirements on stock exchanges for listing, accounting standards, media scrutiny. So we're much more transparent. It's much harder to control the information and the dialogue that occurs within the organization. And of course, we're all interconnected, we're globalized, things are going faster, and you know all these things. But also, our audience is transient. If this was a webinar to employees, if I was the CEO doing a webinar and you were all my employees, how many of you would be my employees this time next year or this time in 6 months' time? You're moving around. How often might you be in my audience as a person in this department, and the next time we have a webinar or town hall, you're in another department? So people are moving around a lot more. So how do we communicate? How do we connect internally to these organizations is a moving target. And also, the primary point I want to get to on this slide is that our communication has become experience-based rather than it's product-based. So, for instance, what is my Starbucks experience? Not, you know, this is great coffee, because in my humble opinion, apologies to anyone who might be offended, but I don't like Starbucks coffee. I think it's awful. I'm a Costa guy. But you go into Starbucks for the experience. That there's the comfy chairs, there's these young baristas, hissing of machines. There's 100 different types of milk. There's only one cow, but 100 different types of milk to choose from. Some food to buy. There's free Wi-Fi. You can sit and write the next Harry Potter novel. It's all that experience, and it's the same in the organization. Today's organization, your communication internally has to be, what is my experience of being in this company? Not what is my career path. Younger generations, X, Y, Z, millennials, whatever, are really in a mindset of, what is my experience? I want to move to a better experience, a more interesting experience. So we need to communicate on that basis, not these kind of block building ways such as career paths or having broadcasts and static communications. And everyone that you're communicating to is a communicator themselves. And they have in their hand, literally through an iPhone, they have the ability to do their own journalism, to write their own stuff. And it only takes one employee to destroy an organization today, and they have the power. When I started in journalism, if somebody wanted to get their message out, an employee, if they weren't happy, they had to convince me. I had to convince an editor, and then we'd have to see if there was space for it in the paper. And this was before online communications. So employees can go direct to the audience as well, as much as anybody else in the organization. But also that you're all influencing each other. Everybody is communicating, talking to each other up, down, and across. And I talk, and we don't have time to go into this, but I mentioned in my book the notion of infusion. We need to have that picture of the way in which we can understand communications in the organization, rather than this hierarchical idea of cascade. And if I had time, I would tell you why I do not like the word cascade. But if you want to check out the book at any point, you can go into that. So that's the paradigm shift. We're in a very different way. And we're also, I bring this sense that we're in, this environment that we're in, down to this one thing, this communications equation, which is C, communication, equals IQ, the intelligence quotient, plus EQ, the emotional quotient, to the power of, well, it depends. What are you trying to do? If you're trying to get people energized, excited, you want to increase the EQ to the power of 100. If you've got a crisis, if you've got a problem, then you want to keep the EQ as to single figures, to the power of single figures. And manage. So what we are as communicators inside the organization is we are emotional managers. We need to look at understanding how do we manage the emotions of the people within the organization. And I don't mean by this being soft, and I don't mean by this getting always excited and walking around with a perma smile on your face as you go around the organization. I'm talking about understanding the sense, the resonance, the feeling that people have about what they do and the people that they work with. It's not touchy-feely stuff in the least. It's a very exact thing of understanding what is that balance between our intelligence, what we know, and the emotions of what we feel. And getting that is crucial. And the way in which we can work with this equation is through dialogue. That is really how we need to start understanding our communications, not this one-way communications, and not the rational, always being rational, having the as long as we have all the right materials, we have the right message set in stone, ready to deliver to an audience as if it was tablets of stone. We want to be much more flexible, and we can only achieve that flexibility and what I call infusion in the organization if we promote dialogue. So what does that mean? Well, I want you to think about 21st century communications in these four ways, four dimensions of intelligence, emotion, interpretation, and narrative. And the way in which these four elements fit together is in what I call the dialog box. Now, you'll see in this that intelligence and narrative are really the objective side of our brain. Emotion interpretation is the subjective side. So we've got left and right, the rational and the emotional side of the equation in terms of how we have dialogue. And then at the middle there, we've got what is the kind of dialogue we need to have. And the best way to explain this to you is to give you a case study. So this is a real life example of an organization of a couple of thousand or so employees based in the US. And the decision was made to move the CEO and the top team would move from their West Coast office to the East Coast office, thereby effectively changing what was the headquarters from West Coast to East Coast. And one morning, the CEO sent out a memo to all employees saying this was what was decided and what was going to happen. And he gave the reason for this, which was very good. And it was a beautifully crafted email, very nicely written. And a couple of weeks or so later, he contacted me and said, I have an issue. My employees are not very happy with this announcement. Can you consult with us on this? So I did, and I used the dialog box to figure out what was going on and what sort of dialogue needed to happen. So what we had essentially in the intelligence was a reorganization. And when we use the dialog box, we capture all of the facts, not what people think, but what people actually know. And I've only put one word in here, but when you use the dialog box in all of these zones, you will just fill in lots of words. So here you will put in what's the timeline, what was decided, when was it decided, what was the position before, how was it communicated. All of that stuff goes into the intelligence that we need to capture. So he makes this announcement, and the first thing I said to him is, and I'm sure pretty much all of you on this call will know this, that you should never have done it in that way in the first place. You don't send information like this out in a kind of cold email first thing on a Monday morning, because the impact from employees of any announcement is different from the impact to external audiences. Journalists, for instance, when they receive an announcement, say about a reorganization, they're sitting there at a press conference, say, and they're writing out the information that's given to them. They talk to competitors, they talk to government, they talk to employees, and so on. They write their story, it gets published, and in the old days, it would, a day later, it would be used to wrap up fish and chips. I don't know what the electronic version of that is now, but they would not be emotionally invested in the story. And most audiences are not terribly emotionally invested. Now, some are, obviously, when you deal with the general public and politics and all that sort of thing. But most company announcements are fairly dry, rational affairs in terms of external communication. But internally, the emotion kicks in. And in this case, the emotion of all the employees was that they felt unsettled. That captures in one word all of the different emotions there were. Some of them were angry, some of them were upset they hadn't been consulted, some of them felt that this is great opportunity. Those in the East Coast office thought brilliant, they felt proud that they were going to be closer to the CEO, all those things. There was concern and worry on the East Coast, would this mean a downgrading of the office, shifting of employees? All of those sorts of emotions come out. And again, you're going to capture all of these in this zone. Then in the next zone, we come to interpretation. And here, again, people are saying different things. This is a good idea. And in fact, the interesting thing in this case study was that at no point did any employee tell me this was a bad decision. They actually thought it was a right decision, but they were unsettled because of the way in which it had been communicated. And they felt that it demonstrated that the leadership was disconnected. Because if you're connected, especially an organization of only a couple of thousand or so employees, most of whom were consultants, then you expected to be consulted before the decision was announced and to be treated as big boys and girls in terms of how it was discussed and how it was announced and how it would be implemented. So they had different views, saying this is a bad way that it was done. We're not listening to the CEO anymore, and so on. So you're capturing all those interpretations of what people are thinking and saying, and trying to capture that, which we do here with this leadership is disconnected. Now, up to this point, in using the dialog box, and you always go in this flow that I've gone through, starting with intelligence, is here you're simply capturing all the data. What's the intelligence? What are the emotions? What is the interpretation? Then comes the difficult bit. As you would expect, any good tool should have a difficult bit, and this is where the difficulties start, because now we need to understand, well, what is the narrative? Every announcement that you make in your organization has its own inherent narrative. Okay? Here, for instance, the narrative is that I, the CEO, am announcing to you that I am moving to the East Coast because we're going to be closer to our growing customer base, and it's going to be better for our international business. We're going to get more exciting projects, and as a result, you're going to get more money, and we're all going to live happily ever after. End of story. So you can build it into a basic story. When you go through this analysis of looking at emotion interpretation, well, what is a narrative? What is the situation that the CEO has now found himself in? A narrative basically comes into three parts, and people really struggle in workshops that I do with coming to terms with this. You as communicators should find this fairly straightforward, but managers who are often not well trained in communications or think about communications find this quite a struggle. Salespeople are often the worst because salespeople want to tell you what they think the audience should be hearing. And the problem is a lot of communication is done on that. We communicate on the basis of what we think our audience should be thinking. Here, we're trying to understand what is the real situation, good and bad. Okay. And it breaks down into three parts. The first part is, what is the situation? Well, the situation here is we have a reorganization. So that's the intelligence. The second is what has been the response, the emotion interpretation. Employees feel unsettled and they feel that the leadership is disconnected. And then the third part of the narrative is what I call the so what factor. Why should we care? Why is it a problem? And here the so what factor was that employees did not feel that they were valued, and as a result, they found it hard to support the change and were not really listening to the CEO. So any announcement the CEO was making, any rah-rah sessions that he might be holding, the employees were skeptical about because they said, look, you're not really listening to us anyway. So clearly that narrative does not reflect the narrative in the intelligence. And again, one of the problems with senior leadership is they're a little bit like the fairy tale, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most beautiful, the fairest of all. And they see themselves in the mirror. They see their communication. Oh, this is a beautiful press release, or this is a beautiful announcement. And look what beautiful collateral we've produced. Here, we're not interested in that. We're trying to understand what is the reality that we face, because it's only when we understand that can we have any form of realistic and productive dialogue with our employees. So then comes the next difficult bit in the dialogue box. I ask participants and anyone who's using this to solve the problem. You've got a disconnect and mismatch here between intelligence and the narrative. So you need to have a dialogue about it. How are you going to have that dialogue? What's that dialogue going to be? And I want the answer in one word. That's the point at which people are really stumped. They've struggled to get to the narrative, which is good, but they've gotten there. And you can, it's only when you really understand the real situation, the reality of your problem. And I don't believe in challenges. That's for HR people. It's these are about issues. These are about problems. These are about things that need to be solved. And the more realistic and blunt you are about understanding that reality, the more likely you are going to be able to find your dialogue word. Now, the word is not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all your problems. What it's going to do is going to identify a neutral space in which you can have a dialogue. Something that if you say this, it will resonate with your audience. They feel that they've been acknowledged, because in any situation, and you'll find this in your home life as well, when there is emotion in a situation, all rationality goes out of the window, because the emotion is not being acknowledged. Until you acknowledge the emotion, you cannot have any form of productive dialogue. That's why people start an argument in one place and then it escalates to the point where they can't remember why the thing happened in the first place, because the emotions are driving the dialogue. With the dialogue word, we're able to first of all define a neutral space to have a discussion. Secondly, it will be a word that gives us a compass to guide us through the dialogue, to make sure that all of our communication is consistent with that word. And incidentally, you may not even actually use the word. You just defined the word. You may use other words. But you're going to measure all of your dialogue, all of your communications against that, and make sure that you act consistent with what you are saying, with what you are having the dialogue about. Now, in the process of getting this word, it's not simply a case of, oh, the word is this. What you need to do is to go through and list all the sorts of words that could be used. So I just ask people to do a brain dump of what word would you think would work here. And I'll discuss in a little bit more about how that dialogue word is then used. But what I'm trying to do is to get a vocabulary of words, not just the word, but a vocabulary of words which are going to work in your dialogue, which also includes words that you don't want to use, words that may just be pressing the wrong buttons with your audience. If you see this word, then your audience are going to say, oh, no, you've not understood, and walk away from the dialogue. So as important as what words we use is what words we try and avoid. And also, one of the first things I do, because I list all the words, I get people to throw the words out and I write them up on a board, and then I score them all out because I only want one word. But one of the first sets of words I always exclude are management words. I get people who will say, you know, oh, this is about being proactive. That's a kind of a buzz term. It's a challenge. That's a buzz term. My favorite was somebody who said we need to co-create, and I said to them, what you do in the privacy of your own home is entirely up to you. But I want to solve a problem here. So you want to avoid all those sort of words that come out of a lot of HR talk, which is why my book deals a lot with HR. It's very close relationship with internal communications. But you want to build this vocabulary of words that mean something to people. In jargon, technical language doesn't help. So when I deal with people in finance or the legal or IT engineering, often they talk in jargon. And one of the things when I ask them to identify their communications problem, they often say, oh, our audience doesn't understand us. That's because you're not speaking their language. Because you, as a communicator, know why you're communicating. You understand all your material, or you should do. The problem is how can I get my audience to have a dialogue around this? And that's why you need to really analyze the language that you're using. In this case, we went through a lot of words, and one of the words that the CEO particularly liked was the word trust. And I said, that's very nice, but it lets you off the hook. And this is the process you go through of analyzing how does the word work? Is the word going to get you into more trouble? So I said to him, okay, you like trust, but you've lost their trust. So you can't talk about something that you've lost. And I kept pushing him. It took me 5 hours to convince him that the word here was sorry. Now, one thing to understand about the dialog box is that it's very specific to your problem. All of these variables are different according to the organization, according to the situation. And that, I think, is one of the reasons this has been so popular around the world, because it's not telling you this is how you have to communicate around a reorganization, for instance. It's saying here is a methodology and a way in which you can look at your communication and figure out what kind of dialogue you need to have so you can build your messaging, you can find your channels, you can create your collateral. This work here is foundational. Everything else after is easy because you've figured out. I always say that the seeds of failure are always sown at the beginning. So here you're trying to make sure you're sowing good seeds in terms of the type of dialogue that you're going to have. And the dialogue word should only last a certain period of time, which you will also define. In this case, sorry did its job right away, because now the rest of the dialog box has changed. The intelligence doesn't need to change. You never need to change your decision with the dialog box if you don't want to. You might do an analysis and decide you want to change something, but you don't need to. So that can always stay static. The question is the how the emotions in interpretation change, and that drives your narrative, your understanding of the situation that you find yourself in. So here, for instance, when he said sorry, the reaction from employees was they felt more settled. The interpretation was the leadership is listening to us, and the narrative was now, well, okay, he's listening to us, and then he could have a conversation around trust. So trust became the new dialogue word, and this process is reiterative until you find that the intelligence and the narrative are mirroring each other. So that's basically how the dialog box works, and telling you in about sort of what 25 minutes, what usually takes 2 days to go through. So, sorry, I've gone in the wrong direction there. So I'm going to touch very briefly on each of these zones. I'll run through them because I want to get to your questions. Intelligence is just about, it's rational, it's knowledge, it's systematizing to make sense. It's about being objective. It's about being able to be ethical. It's individual and it's group intelligence. So it's pretty straightforward, but we're capturing the facts. The emotion, I'll spend a couple of minutes on, because emotion isn't just at being excited because Crystal Palace finally managed to win another game. It's about mood, motivation, instinct. And of course, emotions are revealed physically, so that's part of the communication as well. But what I'm most interested in is the way in which emotion creates or rearranges your priorities. Because if you look at our arrow there, everything we do make an intelligent appraisal from the basis of things like I need to make a plan, I need to do some research, through to high level thinking, such as, well, what does emotion mean? So our brains are working intelligently, rationally all the time through a whole range of things, from how many sugars do I want in my tea, through to neuroscience. But when that intelligent work that our brain is always doing combines with primary emotions, and the primary emotions are fear, anger, sadness, and joy, and all emotions generally fall into those four buckets. When those combine, it actually creates a physiological change. So your audience is not simply thinking it's emotional, it is feeling the emotion. And as a result, that physiological change creates an action. If I have more time, I'd go through a little bit more, but that's basically how it works. And of course, what I'm showing in that arrow happens in a second. So you can upset your audience, emotionally dislodge your audience in a nanosecond, in something that you say or in something that you do. So emotion is very powerful, and as I said, it creates or rearranges. If you watch, for instance, say somebody spilt coffee on your shoes and you're on the way to an important meeting, what do? Well, you don't thank them. You don't say, "Oh dear, that's terrible, there's coffee on my shoes." No, you start shouting at the person and you say, "Look, this is stupid. Why didn't you look where you're going?" Your intelligence says people should not bump into you with coffee. Your intelligence says that there's something unethical about what this person has done. And the anger, that combines with the anger, which makes you sort of irritated, and maybe the action is you want to hit somebody. But the important thing is that you've change your priority. Your priority is now no longer getting to the meeting. Your priority is telling this person what you think about them. So imagine when you're communicating or miscommunicating in the organization, and your managers are doing this, then what's happening is they are spilling, you are spilling cups of coffee on the shoes of the employees. Interpretation is different from intelligence. Interpretation is seeing things from people's own point of view, but also objective. And I think one of the fundamental assumptions that I've made in creating a dialogue box is that most employees are rational and reasonable people. They just want to know the truth. They just want to find out where do they fit in this. And they do have the ability to be subjective and objective, to say, I don't like this decision. I don't want to move my office, but I do understand that the company has to move into a new building. Okay, so we can make that balance and end up doing something that we don't like for the greater good. Of course, we're also trying to interpret verbal and non-verbal signs. We care about our employees, but we're not giving you any bonuses this year. Well, what does that communicate about care? You've got a bigger battle on your hands. Interpretation is also what is the prior understanding and assumptions that your audience has? What do they already know? And of course, when you're confronting your audience, you're confronting a group of people who are coming from many different angles and many different emotions. And when you do that work in the dialogue box, looking at the emotion and the interpretation, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to tease out who is angry, who's happy, who thinks this, who thinks that, in order to find what the dominant attitudes are, which will also help you to define what your communications objective is. Because your communications objective is not necessarily the same as the business objective. I had one guy doing a dialogue box in a session where he was launching an app, he was rolling it out, and had rolled it out to the EVPs and the VPs of the organization. And he said, I need 100% of people. The reason I'm communicating is I need 100% of EVPs and VPs to use this before I can roll it out to senior managers and other managers. When we went through the motion interpretation, we actually discovered, well, first of all, only 30% are not using it. So what are their emotions? What are they saying about it? So your communications objective, in fact, is how do I communicate to 30% of people who are not using this app? Because the other 70%, you don't need to worry about. You have a different strategy for them and an easy strategy for them. Also, interpretation is about what are people are revealing or concealing. You can communicate not to show people things, but to hide things. So people trying to find the truth. Usually when I present this slide, I will give people a few minutes to look at the picture, because you may not be listening to what I was saying earlier at first, because you were too busy trying to see how many trees are in that face. So how many faces, sorry, are in that tree, wrong way around. But that's what interpretation is. People are trying to find, well, what is this? What is this picture? And you will have seen between 2 and 4 faces in that right away. But you're not satisfied with seeing that, because you can see there's other things going on. And that's what your audience is doing all the time. They're trying to understand, interpret from their point of view what you're trying to communicate. And the dialogue box is a way of trying to balance that by you having a better understanding of what those interpretations are. And it's not about agreeing with them. It's about identifying them. And then you can start to see where the agreements and disagreements occur. And then finally, in the 4 quadrants is narrative. And storytelling has become a big thing in communications today, but it goes back to the origins of humanity. Storytelling has always been used to illuminate and produce new knowledge. All of the religious books that from the beginning of time have stories, not just rules and regulations. And I'm not going to spend much time on the rest of these points, just the one point, which is the next one, that all narrative is still interpretive. And what you're trying to do is identify in your narrative, in the dialogue box, the most neutral, objective narrative that you possibly can, getting as much of your interpretation out of it so that you can get what the real problem is. Because we can tell a story about somebody one way, we can change the way in which we communicate the same story, and people could end up with exactly the opposite impression of somebody. So narrative is highly interpretive, so we have to be careful with that. So then we come into the dialogue itself, the dialogue word, and it's not easy. It does take quite a lot of work, but you only need the one word because it's going to give you that focus and clarity to capture the essence of what you need to communicate. And if you can get the essence, then you can build everything else around it. But the word needs to resonate and connect emotionally. That's why I take out jargon and buzzwords. Not just that people don't necessarily understand them, but they don't get excited by it. You know, you're looking for something that resonates or something that people feel acknowledges. So it should have impact and it should be action oriented. And it can be a negative word. It doesn't need to be positive. You know, there's nothing in the dialogue box that says that this is about making your employees happy. If you want your employees to be happier, just pay them more to work less and most of them will be happy. It's about engaging them in a grown-up conversation in a neutral way in order to problem solve together and have a greater sense of what I call democracy in the workplace, of participation in decisions and in the running of things, which doesn't take away from leadership, but it also helps people, in fact, to inspire more, to have better leadership. But all dialogue boxes depend on the context and the target audience about what's going to work. And what's interesting here is having worked around the world with this dialogue box with people in many different cultures. I say it gets a 96% rating, and I don't say that to boast, but to show that whichever culture this has been done in, people identify with it because it's a structure in which they can analyze their own culture. They can analyze their own words. This isn't a kind of a Western construct. So in conclusion, I think I've just about rattled through enough to leave a good amount of time. I apologize if I've had to go like the winner of the Grand National at the end of on Saturday, and I did predict the winner, incidentally. Didn't put any money on it, but I'll just rattle off a conclusion here. That first of all, everyone in the organization is a communicator. I worked with ArcelorMittal. We had 320,000 employees. That meant we had to think about 320,000 communicators. I'm working with SABIC at the moment with 40,000. That means there's 40,000 communicators around the world who are influencing each other, who are part of the dialogue in the organization. All managers should be employee engagers. Employee engagement isn't an HR function. It's a leadership that HR needs to give. But the actual how you're going to get employees engaged has to be done by managers through effective communication. And that's why the program I'm doing with SABIC exists, because they took the brave step. I admire them for this. That they took the step of saying, we want you to do this work so that we can get depth in the way in which our managers communicate around the world, and to understand their role as communicators and engagers. I mentioned in Infusion, participation, that it's only by people participating in dialogue that you will have a real dialogue. So I'll stop there, give you questions, and thank you for bearing with me for, yeah, it's just over 40 minutes.
That's great, David. Thank you so much. I can see a couple of people are typing out some questions, but just to kick us off, a first question. You talked a lot, obviously, around the tough challenges you've had with leaders and trying to convince them of, the importance of dialogue, but a transparent dialogue. And often that's really, really important to get that kind of message across. So how would you recommend, I guess, internal communicators to broach that conversation with their leaders in terms of how they should convince them that dialogue is really, really important at the heart of the organization? How do we get the leaders on board?
That's a good question, actually, because the struggle here is really for internal communications, especially to figure out having dialogue as well. Who's involved? Because HR will have a point of view, the leadership has a point of view, your internal audience, and so on. And it takes a brave communicator to step forward and say, well, actually, we need to have a dialogue around this. And to do that, I would say have a go at using a dialog box, essentially. Do a dialog box for the leader. The dialog box can be used for an entire strategy of an organization. We've done this with Samick. Or it can be used for a one-on-one that you have a problem with one individual because they have emotion, they think things. And the other thing I should say about the dialog box, incidentally, is here I've used it to solve a problem that existed. When I do training, I give another case study about a company that wanted to prevent a problem. So they were using it proactively. So it can be used reactively or proactively. But you could do a dialogue box that says, how do I talk to my CEO, or how do I talk to my leaders in the organization? What do they know? What are the facts of our situation? What emotion? And eventually end up with, well, this is what the real situation is. This is what I'm facing as a communicator, an internal communicator with my leadership. This is the narrative. So what dialogue could I have that would allow a good conversation to take place for me to broach this, and the dialogue will open it up for you. And the more the deeper you can go in those other zones, the more you will get your narrative, and the more you will come up with not just the word, but the vocabulary of words that will allow you to go into the room with leadership and get them to pay attention. What I would say is that often with leadership, I tend to find communicating upwards, negative words tend to be more effective than positive words. So in other words, it's better to scare your CEO than to applaud them. But certainly, if you speak to them realistically, then I think the dialogue box can help you achieve that.
Great, thank you, David. So we have some more questions that's coming through. Someone is asking, my question is around effectiveness and speed around sourcing input to your model. In your experience, are there particular tools you find enhance the speed and relevance of content from the organization?
Yeah, I mean, you can do, you've got surveys. I actually counsel that I think employee surveys are a complete waste of time, frankly. And the reason I say that is because it takes a snapshot at a particular point in time. All the variables are frozen in time with a survey. And you're needing to communicate and work in real time. Annual performance reviews suffer from the same thing. So you need a much more real-time way of doing that. Now, there are different ways you can approach it. One is to have a focus group, bring people together and have test out a dialogue to capture some of those interpretations. Another way is using pulse type polls on your intranet. Ask people some of these questions so you can be cleverly worded so that they don't necessarily see what you're at, so to speak. But you can get quite fast ones. But the reality is, and I'm going to be cynical here. My origins are in journalism, so there's a natural tendency towards cynicism. That somebody told me years ago when I started as a journalist. He said, as a journalist, you only need to speak to 3 people. If you speak to a 4th, then you're a consultant and an expert. Views are not as hard to find out. Yeah, you can do all sorts of algorithms. I'm not dismissing the need for research and so on, but you can often capture a lot, especially when you're up against time pressures, by an intelligent appraisal of A, the blindingly obvious, and B, the easy to find out. So I don't think you need to overcomplicate the process of getting your data into the dialog box. There are times when you might want to go very much in depth or do an investigation and so on and so forth. Those would be very specific situations, I suspect, though. Okay.
Fantastic, thanks, David. Right, we have another question here. Is you used a great example for dealing with an issue after the event to try to recover. Do we assume you can use this at the beginning to make sure it's created correctly in the first place?
Yeah, so when I train organizations in this, then I give two case studies, and the second case study is precisely what the question is asking. It was an organization that wanted to avoid a strike, so we did a dialogue box with their leaders who were going to make an announcement, and so the next day they had to make the announcement, and so we had to try and that's where, you know, they've done a lot of work. They've done amazing work as an organization in terms of the collateral, the messages, and all of that. The question was, is how were they going to do this and emotionally manage a situation where, if it went wrong, the unions could have taken advantage, and you could have had severe disruption. And this wasn't just this is across Europe, potentially. So we did a dialogue box where we had to figure out worst case scenarios. So what could be the worst kind of emotional situation that you could get into if you miscommunicated this? So we make an assumption that say we miscommunicated this, what would the emotion be around this intelligence? What would people say? What sort of worst scenario narrative could occur? And so how would we have a dialogue that would help us tackle the worst? Because if you can deal with the worst scenario, all the others become a bit easier. So they came up with a strategy for doing that. So you can use it proactively. And in fact, I would usually counsel you should use it proactively rather than after the horse is bolted.
Great, thanks, David. We've had a number of questions actually on the same theme, so I'm just going to wrap them all up into one question, which is around measurement. So, how can someone asking how you can measure the effectiveness approach specifically, and can you measure the impact or change in emotion after using the dialogue? And again, I think you just talked about it a little bit there. And is it something you can use to anticipate emotion?
The measurement is the holy grail of communications, isn't it? Yeah, we always want to know, well, how can we measure it? And the problem with measurement is it's often used as a defense, and more than it's like memos. They're written to defend rather than to inform. And one of the things that I counsel in the book is really to try and find a way of building a communicating organization, and a communicating organization will become a trusting organization. And that would be the kind of measurement. If you build trust within the organization, if you build support, so you can do polls and things like that to measure the success to a certain extent. But like all communications, it's also a belief system that you need to believe that your communications are the right ones, and a dialogue box is a way of helping you to figure out what those are. And it's like, you know, it's difficult to prove a negative, and that's why communications is hard to actually measure, because you'll soon find out if your communication goes wrong. When it goes right, nobody bothers. You know, if it's like on social media, you know, be offensive. That's how you get the reaction, because if you agree with people, they're not going to say anything to you. So measurement is actually inherently skewed. So I personally don't rate it as that useful an activity. In terms of anticipating emotion, then I mean that's what you're trying to do if you're using Dialog Box proactively. Is trying to predict, well, what sort of emotions might occur. And again, that's something that you can figure out. It's a process of imagination as much as a process of measurement.
Great, thank you. And we just have one last question, which is, when you say all staff are communicators, what does this mean in practice? Are you using internal social media tools, or are you empowering them in some other way?
That's a good question. Your organizations, you need to think about them in two ways in terms of communication. Communications, corporate communications, internal communications is a function. It's something that you have as a leadership function in an organization. And one of the reasons I wrote the book and developed the Dialog Box was having been in leadership situations in communications myself, I got fed up with CEOs and leaders in strategy meetings telling me we have a communications problem. And I would say to them, no, we don't. You have a communications problem. It's not my problem. You're the ones who are miscommunicating this. So we're talking here about communications not as a function, but as an activity. And we need to make that distinction in the way in which we talk to our leaders. The other way in which to understand communication is the formal and the informal flow of communication, and the informal flow is extremely powerful. By that I mean the rumor mill, the gossip, the water cooler talk, whatever you want to call it. And you can use that to your own advantage, because one of the things you can do with the Dialog Box is identify an audience of people who are positive, who understand, and communicate directly to them. You don't need to go through the formal flow of communication. You can go through informal briefings. There are people, if you tell them something, they will tell 100 people. There's other people you can tell one person and they won't tell anybody. I have a son and a daughter like that. Tell my son something, he wouldn't tell anybody. He wouldn't say boo. Tell my daughter, she'd be out telling everybody and be on social media. So you're looking for who are those natural communicators informally in the organization. And when you talk about how do I influence my leaders, sometimes maybe you need to influence the influencers within that leader's area. So you might have somebody in your team who has good relations with the finance or the IT people, have them communicate rather than you going peer to peer. So there are different ways of mapping that out, and that's why they talk about with Infusion having a much more informal way of understanding how we are communicating, not simply insisting on all these formal tools and formal processes.
That's fantastic. Thank you, David. I think that just with 1 minute, 3 minutes to go, that just about wraps us up for today. I'd just like to thank you very, very much for giving your time to deliver this webinar today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And as I said, the recording will be available soon. So have a great rest of the day. Many thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much.